Good afternoon. We'll have this afternoon a session on expectations. We'll have a paper that will be presented by Carlos Viana de Carvalho from PUC-Rio. After that, we'll have Ernesto Pesten's presentation. Ernesto is from Banco Central de Chile. And after that, we'll have Elias Bagli's presentation. Elias is also from the Banco Central de Chile. So I think we should get started. Carlos, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for including our paper in the conference. I will stand because it's after lunch, and then I won't fall asleep, and maybe I'll keep your attention a bit more focused. So the paper is on price setting when expectations are unanchored. The slides hopefully will come up soon. Joint with...
Just one second.
Okay, yes. Joint with Daniel Abib, João Aires, Marco Bonomo, Stefano Eusebio, Silvia Matos, who is sitting here in the audience, and Marina Peropato. We thought we were the paper with the highest number of co-authors, but we lost to the previous one that had 10, so we're second. Okay, so here's the motivation, a quote by Ben Bernanke in a 2007 speech that I think is fantastic, many research ideas there. So he's talking about how long-run inflation expectations vary over time. They are not perfectly anchored. The extent to which they are anchored, depends on economic developments and the conduct of monetary policy. Yeah. So let's wait, because I'm reading the quote here and you guys don't see it. So give me just a second.
It wasn't according to the expectations.
Exactly. And see the names of people. Okay. As I was mentioning, now you can see all the names, and Silvia Matos is sitting there right in the middle of the auditorium. So this is the quote I was talking about by Ben Bernanke in his 2007 speech. So the first paragraph is about how inflation expectations do vary over time. They're not perfectly anchored, and the extent to which they are anchored also changes. And then he talks about, this question, how do various measures of inflation expectations feed through to actual pricing behavior? Promising recent research has looked at price changes at very disaggregated levels for insight into the pricing decision. And here he's talking about, classic papers in the literature from the early to mid 2000s. But this research has not yet linked pricing decisions at the macroeconomic level to inflation expectations. Undertaking that next step would no doubt be difficult, but also very valuable. So we're trying to, move in that direction in this paper. And the paper that Elias is going to present later, you're going to see yet, other steps also in this direction of linking expectations to pricing. So what we do in the paper is present evidence that inflation expectations matter for individual pricing decisions. In particular, we run regressions of pass-through of costs into prices using microdata, right? More specifically, even we look at exchange rate pass-through, but think of that as just a way that the literature has used to look at the pass-through of costs into prices. And we allow for that sensitivity or the pass-through coefficient from cost into prices to vary as a function of the state of expectations, okay? So we allow pass-through to be different when expectations are unanchored. For that, we combine various microdata sets over a roughly 13-year period during which the degree of unanchoring or anchoring or unanchoring of inflation expectations in Brazil varied significantly. So that's kind of a key requirement for being able to answer this question. You need expectations to have really moved around, and I'm going to show evidence that we had these periods of unanchoring. And also, we dissect an episode of an abrupt change in monetary policy in 2011, which we argue caused the unanchoring of inflation expectations. Okay, so you can think that, you know, policy caused the unanchoring of inflation expectations, then they started to respond to a bunch of things, and we showed that while expectations were unanchored, pass-through from costs, in particular exchange rate movements into prices, increases, and it increases quite dramatically. So re-anchoring, which occurred towards the end of the sample, involved a big regime shift, including presidential impeachment and a dramatic change in the direction of economic policies. And finally, we developed and calibrated a simple model in which expectations can be unanchored and use the model to interpret the regressions we run in the data. Okay, so it's a structural interpretation. We don't want to argue too strongly that, you know, this is the model to think about that, but it's a model that allows a structural interpretation of the empirical findings. So here's what we're going to do to give you a gist of the empirical approach. So these are kind of standard pass-through regressions that the literature has used, work by Gita Gopinath that was here yesterday, Oleg Choki, Roberto Rigobon. So basically you look when firms change price, you look at how long that price had been fixed for, how many months, and then you look at what was the change in the exchange rate over the period during which that price was kept fixed, right? So if you have microdata with prices changing at different times and remaining fixed for different amounts of time, you're going to have variation in this panel. You know, prices that are changed today, they were exposed in a sense to different changes in the exchange rate over their life. That's kind of the beta 1 coefficient there, okay? And what we're really interested in this red object, which is the beta 2 coefficient, which is the possibility of a differential pass-through when expectations are unanchored. This index here is going to be an index separating regimes with anchored or unanchored expectations, okay? We're also going to run regressions where we use a continuous measure of the degree of an anchor. So rather than just say anchored or unanchored, we're going to have a measure of the extent of an anchoring and include that in the regression instead of the dummy, okay? So also, one other thing we do, actually I'm going to skip that for the sake of time, but there is some, very briefly, there is some microdata on what firms expect to do with their own prices in the future. That's from a survey conducted by IBRE, Getúlio Vargas Foundation. We use that survey to connect to the professional expectations, which we use in the paper, and show that, you know, firms' views of what they're going to do with their prices are kind of connected with professionals' inflation expectations. So what we find first is, as I mentioned already, monetary policy can cause or lead to the unanchoring of inflation expectations. That's kind of, we think, maybe obvious for people to think who think about monetary policy, but it's kind of, in our view, a very clear example where, you know, monetary policy can cause the unanchoring of inflation expectations. And then when expectations are unanchored, wholesaling firms, wholesalers increase pass-through of exchange rate movements into prices. The differences are sizable. Pass-through increases from between 3 and 10 times when you move from anchored inflation expectations to unanchored inflation expectations. Firms also, they make fewer mistakes when they try to anticipate their next price change, but I'm going to skip these results for the sake of time. And then as in the data, the model delivers a higher exchange rate pass-through when expectations are unanchored, okay? In the model, the effect we get is basically doubling the pass-through, not as large as what we find in the data. I'll skip the literature. My slides are very long. I didn't have time to do concise version, so I'm going to skip here. Outline, I'm going to talk about the abrupt U-turn in monetary policy that caused the unanchoring. Show you briefly this measure of the degree of unanchoring. Empirical strategy I already showed. I'm just going to point out a couple more things that we do, then go through results. And finally, if I have a little time, I'll show you some things about the model. Okay, so data, very brief. I'm not going to go into details, but one main data set we use is the microdata underlying the PPI. So this is IPA Industrial, for those familiar with the Brazilian data, from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Okay, IPA covers different sectors: agriculture, mining, manufacturing. We're going to stick to manufacturing firms. These firms are associated with 21 manufacturing sectors. So here's just an example of what the data are like. For example, a sector would be like textile products. And then within that sector, you have different products. One product, for example, would be cotton fabrics. And then within cotton fabrics, you have the individual, so the item level information, which is really the price that you should track over time to see if the firm is changing its price or not, okay? So this is kind of quote unquote standard PPI microdata for those who know the literature. Sample goes from July 2008 until December 2020. Weights are from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Manufacturing Industry Survey is this other survey that asks a lot of qualitative questions about firms. How are your inventories? How is demand? How are your costs? What do you expect to do with your prices in the future? We use those observations mainly as control variables, but we use this question about what firms plan to do with their own prices to connect to the survey of professional forecasters, which is the focus survey conducted by the central bank. Okay, so think of these as sectoral product level data used as controls. And then the other piece of data that we use is the focus survey. So this is the survey of professional forecasters conducted by the Central Bank of Brazil. I'm not going to go into details. There's already a body of literature using this survey, some very nice papers published already. Basically, we're going to use this to measure the degree of unanchoring, show evidence that expectations were unanchored, but it's important to mention, and this is going to be a difference compared to Elias' paper that he's going to present later, that these are really professional forecaster expectations. Brazil does not have like a survey of firm numerical inflation expectations, which Chile is very fortunate to have. So for example, the incentives, the context for the best forecasters, yesterday you saw, the central bank, Diogo, the Deputy Governor Diogo here, awarding like the prize to the best forecaster. So these are kind of the incentives that the survey has. Okay, brief history of inflation target in Brazil. Not going to have time for this, but basically we're going to exploit a window after July 2008, which is when we start having like the micro data. And there's going to be this window here in between the abrupt U-turn and what we call the re-anchor, where I'm going to show evidence that expectations were unanchored, okay? So we're going to have an anchored period before the abrupt U-turn, an unanchored period, and then another anchored period towards the end after re-anchoring of inflation expectations. So this is a measure of sort of 3 years out inflation expectations. We're moving the new version to the paper to 4 years out. So this is the longest possible horizon that you can have in Brazil. The results are essentially identical. Basically, what happens, there's an earlier crisis here that we don't talk about. We don't have data for that period. So inflation expectations, they started moving away from target slowly. They jump, where I'm going to show daily data showing that they really jumped after this abrupt U-turn. Then there's a period when expectations were away from target, and then they were sort of re-anchored, but I'm going to show you more data about that if I speed up. Okay, so this is the abrupt U-turn. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about this episode. So this is the first half of 2011. The central bank is tightening policy after having eased policy in response to the global financial crisis. Central bank was tightening in increments of 25 basis points. And then in its August meeting, the central bank was widely expected to remain on hold, but it did not. Okay, so the central bank cut rates by 50 basis points unexpectedly. Here's a zoom on what happened. So the central bank was tightening. It had changed from 50 to 25 basis points increments. And then in an unexpected fashion, it cut rates by 50 basis points and embarked on a quite aggressive easing cycle. Okay, I'm going to show you some data of what happened to expectations after that episode. So this is first like the monetary policy surprise related to the surprises that people were talking about earlier. This is the distribution. So the pinkish reddish histogram is the distribution of the surprises of individual forecasters when they saw this. They had an expectation for the policy decision. Central bank cut by 50 basis points. Basically shows that almost everybody was surprised by 50 basis points at that meeting. A little bit of variation. Some people expected an increase of 25 basis points. They were a bit more surprised, okay? So big surprise. The gray bars are the histograms of every other monetary policy meeting in the sample. And basically you get a huge mass So this is observation times participants, like 80% of people times meetings, they get it right. Okay, so this was quite an unusual decision. Here's some anecdotal evidence, not gonna go into detail. If you click, these are my translation of the title, but this is newspaper evidence arguing that, this was a politically driven decision, that the central bank would have problems with inflation expectations. One former governor went as far as to say the inflation target had been abandoned, okay? Here's with daily data what happened to expectations, again, 3 years out, and the jump you see here is exactly the day after that meeting, okay? And then you see another jump, and then expectations start to drift a little bit, and the gray area here already sort of hints that we're gonna call that the moment of an anchoring. Here's what happened to the cross-sectional dispersion in inflation expectations, which another measure that people have advocated, is informative of anchoring and unanchoring. And you see, dispersion was already increasing, but after that meeting, it just spiked higher, again, suggesting this was an anchoring caused by monetary policy decision. We can look at how inflation expectations at the individual level changed after that meeting. And here are, histograms showing how the inflation expectations for 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, and so forth, changed after that meeting. These are the pinkish reddish bars versus after a typical or the other meetings. Usually you don't see a lot of action, but in that particular meeting, inflation expectations really shifted to the right. Okay, fixed event, fixed horizons. We can show this, okay, very briefly. Re-anchoring entailed a regime change, impeachment of the president, complete change of direction of monetary policy. We're going to basically say that inflation expectations were re-anchored around August 2016. The exact timing is not as clear-cut as the beginning of the anchoring, but it is not so important. Okay. So here's the shades. So we have a anchored regime first, unanchored regime, and then re-anchored regime. This is again the dispersion of inflation expectations. I can show with regressions how inflation expectations respond to monetary policy surprises, depending on whether expectations are anchored or not. Okay, so the first coefficient is telling you how did inflation expectations for the 1 year horizon, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, how they responded to that abrupt monetary policy shock. Basically, the central bank cut rates unexpectedly. Inflation expectations just jumped. This is 2-day response after the meeting, okay? Looking at the Friday after the copol. So inflation expectations just spiked up. If you look at when expectations are anchored, basically you see no response of inflation expectations to monetary policy surprises, only at the 1 year horizon. Maybe this is transmission of monetary policy. And when expectations are unanchored, in meetings other than that U-turn surprise, you also see an important response of inflation expectations. So basically, this is telling you that when expectations are unanchored, according to our definition, you start to see this response of even long horizon expectations to monetary policy. The same is true for exchange rate movements. This is for fixed horizons. Here's, for example, how longer run inflation expectations are related to changes in 12-month inflation expectations. When expectations are anchored, there's basically no relationship. When expectations are unanchored, you see a meaningful relationship between 12-month inflation expectations and longer run. So this is all consistent with unanchored behavior, and these are different measures that the literature has looked at, okay? I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. Now, this is kind of a 0-1, a regime definition of an anchoring. We also have a continuous measure of an anchoring. This is an adaptation of Chekedian-Krauss measure of credibility. I'm not going to go into details, but basically is an index that gives you the extent of an anchoring, if you will, over time. Okay, and we're also going to use that in the regressions. So let me jump to the regressions. Otherwise, I won't be able to show the meat or the core of the paper. I already showed what we're going to do. We're going to allow this differential pass-through depending on whether expectations are anchored or not. We run horse races with nonlinear effect of exchange rate changes, different things that I'm not going to have time to tell you. I'm just going to try to show you the core results here. And I'm going to skip this, again, for the sake of time. So this is kind of maybe one of the key tables in the paper. Okay, so the first column gives you kind of an average pass-through over the whole sample upon the first price change. So this is telling you that the first time firms change prices, they pass through 4% of the change in the exchange rate into their prices. And this is just the first round, if you will, okay? We're adding results with lags and so forth, but so this is what we get. Now, the second column allows for a differential pass-through when expectations are unanchored. This is the second line here. Remember, you have to add these two coefficients. So basically, this is telling you that when expectations are anchored, pass-through is kind of 2%. When expectations are unanchored, pass-through goes up to 6.8%. So it's kind of triples, okay? If you look at the last column, it's just adding controls. We always have time and individual fixed effects here. And basically here, pass-through goes from roughly 1% and barely significant to 5% and clearly significant, okay? So this is telling you pass-through is really coming from times when expectations are unanchored. Very recent result, we got this today. Instead of using the exchange rate, which of course is endogenous to monetary policy and so forth, here we're instrumenting the Brazilian real with a basket of other emerging market currencies, okay? And the results are pretty much the same. So I'm not gonna spend more time here, but it's something we've been meaning to do, and we got the results this morning. Now, if you switch from the 0-1 definition of anchoring and unanchoring and instead look at a continuous measure, this is what you get, okay? So the first column is the same as you saw before. The second column is telling you the following information. Baseline pass-through when expectations are fully anchored is kind of around 2%. When expectations are fully unanchored, so meaning that index here is equal to unit, pass-through goes up to roughly 17%. Okay, so this is kind of a 9-fold increase in pass-through when expectations are unanchored. I'm running out of time, so we have results adding lags of the exchange rate, and the same finding goes through. Pass-through, even of kind of second round effects, is larger when inflation expectations are unanchored. Is it about non-linearity? We have evidence showing that it is not about non-linearity. It's really about the regime of expectations, but I'm not going to have time to show you that. Is it really that when expectations are anchored, inflation is higher? So it's really about high inflation, not expectations. We have evidence that showing that this is not the case. It's to some extent about inflation, but it's more so about inflation expectations. Firms get it right more often. And then I don't have time to talk about the model because I ran out of time in 2 seconds. And thanks for your time.
Thank you, Carlos. So now we'll have Ernesto's comments. The floor is yours, Ernesto.
Thank you. You need to check the...
Sorry.
I can do the model.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so Carlos said in the path. He started up, so we should all stand up now. This is, I am Ernesto Pastel from the Bank of Chile, Central Bank of Chile. I am glad to discuss this paper. So let me start doing a brief summary. I'll say that this is typical Carlos paper, like I write in the right paper at the right time. This is a little bit unfair with the other co-authors, but you know, where it is. So to me, the main takeaway is that exchange rate pass-through is stronger in Brazil when expectations are an anchor. Actually, the paper goes a little bit further and says, because expectations are an anchor, then exchange rate pass-through, it turns out to be stronger in Brazil, between 3 times or 4 times, depending on the way that is measured. They also have a rich set of empirical side results. For instance, Carlos didn't have time to talk about that, but they have about forecasting errors where price setters are going to make a mistake when they can foresee a price change to be positive or negative, and compared to the actual price change that they get when the time arrives. It's an impressive work of collecting and using complement data sources. It's a state-of-the-art empirical strategies, basically exploit the exchange rate variation within firms' price spells, which is the best that we could do. And then they come up with a new Keynesian model with the possibility of expectation to be anchored and unanchored that fits the main findings. The bottom line message, the bottom line mechanism is the following. If you are a price setter and you are subject to some sort of price frictions, then when you set your prices, you have to think about what are going to be your optimal the current prices, how optimal is going to be for future desired price that you may have. Therefore, expectations of inflation matter. When expectations of inflation are anchored, then you expect that your future price is not going to be that different from your current price. Then when you see, let's say, a devaluation of the real, then you want to increase your prices, but not so much because you want your prices to be about right for a long period of time. But if expectations are an anchor, you expect that in the future, prices are going to be much higher, so your desired price is going to be much higher, and then you are more prompt to increase your price today when there is this devaluation of the real. This is work in progress. Actually, a lot of things that Carlos showed, it was not in the version of the paper that I saw, so I'm going to evaluate the paper on that way. So comment one, I wish I would have written this paper, but it was Carlos as always. And so let me try to be harsh. This is the second best thing I can do. So to me, what would be the ideal exercise to establish causality from expectations and anchoring to exchange rate pass-through? So an issue, as always, is the joint determination, in this case, between expectations and price setting, and other things that may be going on at the same time. Thank you. So we require an instrument, an anchoring shocks. But this paper does not have an anchoring shocks. What this paper claims, and actually in the current version that Carlos has, he put a lot of effort on telling us that there is a shock that creates anchoring of expectations. But that is not quite the same of having a shock on an anchoring expectation and nothing else. A lot of things are happening at the same time. So it's very difficult to properly identify. Now, to be fair, I doubt that such type of shocks can ever exist. So we must content ourselves with a second best, which is actually what Carlos and co-authors are doing. But the only little caveat is that we need to interpret results in that way and not as we have a smoking gun of identification. Comment two is that ideally, also one would love to have data on expectations, price setters, and controls for a representative set of firms of the Brazilian economy. In reality, the paper has expectation data from professional forecasters, controls from sectoral data, and a small non-representative fraction of Brazilian firms for price setting. So, for instance, one thing that the paper cannot do is that they cannot exploit across firms heterogeneity in expectation on the degree of the anchoring and compare that with the firms' behavior on price setting. So, this is unfortunate. It's the way that it is. And I've been asked to pass a message to Sylvia that she could put together the data set, the proper data set. It would be great service to Brazil and to the paper, of course. For side results, they have qualitative questions. This is stuff about the forecasting errors. Is it qualitative? The firms have been asked whether they expect their prices to be higher or lower in the future. It would be great to have a quantitative questions. Those are much more difficult. Those are much more valuable on the one hand, but are much more difficult to get in surveys because of a number of cognitive biases and things going on at the time of designing the surveys. But acknowledging all data limitations, again, to me, the paper performs an exercise as good as it can get, and in that sense, it's a great piece that it's very informative. So taking a stock, what I'll say that is the main conclusion is that in the small subset of firms that the paper can check, foreign exchange rate pass-through to prices has been higher in episodes when experts' expectations go wild. This is weaker than claiming causality, but it still is strongly policy relevant. I mean, we all want to know exactly when pass-through is going to be higher, and we should try to react accordingly to that. Sound monetary policy minimizes the state when expectations go wild, when the expectation become an anchor. That for sure is going to be a lot of help in periods where there are going to be large swings on exchange rates or exchange rate pass-through may vary. But this does not mean that exchange rate pass-through is going to remain low in all possible states when expectations are going to be anchored. Because when expectations go unanchored, it's true that exchange rate pass-through is higher, but we don't really know whether it is the shock that makes expectation to be unanchored, what is triggering the pass-through to be higher, or is really the unanchoring what makes expectations to pass-through to be higher. So I am a nerdy guy, so let me do a final nerdy observation. Frequency of price changes do not change so much between episodes of anchoring and unanchoring, which to me, we don't really know, but it's really reassuring of the type of models that central banks tend to use, where we tend to think that all the margin of adjustment that firms do is on the intensive margin of price changes and not so much in the extensive margin of price changes. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ernesto. So now we're going to open the floor for questions. I have two over there. So we've reached the maximum of 3 questions. So any further questions we can do later on?
Well,
okay.
It's a great paper. What if you measure the pass-through instead of using the spot effects, use like focus 1-year forecast or 6-month forecast, because maybe the price setting process is more attached to the long-term view of FX by agents, right? Maybe this or like a top 5, top 20 from focus would be a better sample for this perceived effects from in price setting. We did this 20 years ago, tried to do this, remember? So maybe this is something.
Okay. We're going to take the other question.
Thank you, Carlos. Great paper. I have one, I'm kind of worried about the endogeneity of these things in a sense that when you have an anchored inflation expectations, also especially the volatility of the exchange rate is much higher. So I was thinking about, let's say, if you have a model that for small changes, you don't change your price, but if you have big changes, you kind of change. So in a sense, how can you see the causality between expectations, exchange rate, and prices, and how would you disentangle that? Thanks.
Thank you. Elias, would you like to ask a question?
Actually, I wanted to make a comment related to what Ernesto mentioned at the very end. So last week we published a monitor that's built on the microdata of the bank, and it's called something like prices, margins, and frictions. And the part of the monitor that has frictions documents sort of in real time the frequency at which firms are changing prices. And that frequency varies quite a bit. So it also, the size of the price changes varies. So I'm not so clear about the last statement that Ernesto made, that it's reassuring that, you know, the frequency is kind of stacked, because it's definitely, this is not the Calvo model, what's going on in the data. And I can tell you that in the current period of high inflation in Chile, the frequency of price changes essentially doubled, as well as the size of price changes. So there you go. That's where the high inflation comes from. But it's also because of firms are acting more frequently on the decisions.
Okay. Carlos, would you like to comment?
Yes. Okay, thanks a lot for the comments, Ernesto, for the nice discussion. Very quick comment. So regarding causality, I completely agree. I mean, it's any instrument that you think about. For example, we show that expectations start reacting to monetary policy shocks, but monetary policy shocks are going to do other things that affect price setting and inflation. So I think the exclusion restriction is going to be technical here. It's going to be violated for any instrument that you think. So I kind of share the lack of hope that we could ever get like true exogenous variation on anchoring. Having said that, we're trying to argue that the first jump was really caused by like a monetary policy change that, of course, you know, we have to convince you of that, right? But that was hard to justify on the basis of economic conditions at the time. There's anecdotal evidence. You know, central bank cut rates dramatically over time. Even expectations were going up. So people perceived the change in monetary policy at the time, kind of a break in the tail rule. And that in a high frequency approach sort of caused the jump of exchange rate of the, sorry, expectations right away. But then over time, I agree that, you know, the variation is endogenous to a bunch of things and we cannot find instruments. About the small number of firms, you know, so what is really small is the number of firms that we can merge and use the other survey about the direction of the questions. The number of firms in the PPI survey is typical. And we have weights that make them representative because, you know, this is a price index computed by Getúlio Vargas Foundation to be a nationally represented. So it has kind of a few thousands, I think the overall is kind of maybe 5,000 firms, and then we lose some, and as we, you know, collapse the spells, we have roughly, I think, 3,000 firms, but they are large, you know, so it's kind of a representative sample of firms. So that wasn't clear. It's our fault. We're going to make sure it's clear. On the frequency, I agree. So the period we have here, like, inflation was not that high when expectations were unanchored, to some extent because the government was using administrative prices, keeping them artificially low to avoid inflation from being too high. So maybe that explains in some part because why frequency didn't go up. In 2015, the energy prices had to be adjusted by 50% to correct for all the distortions. There we see a little bit more action. And when we use CPI data, so Sylvia and I and other quarters, we have a data paper with Brazilian CPI microdata, we see the frequency varying a lot more with inflation, as you just pointed out. Very briefly to finish. Focus FX, Alexandre Azar's question, we're looking into that. The frequency I talked about, and finally summers. So, you mentioned like a nonlinearity story. We have a horse race with a nonlinearity specification. We can talk about it later. It doesn't seem to be really about nonlinearity, but what we try to do, and this is the first slide I showed, the first time I showed today, was this version where it's not the Brazilian real. It's really, maybe you could think of like the global, the dollar component affecting emerging market exchange rates. And that should be exogenous to Brazil to a large extent. So we're less concerned about endogeneity of the exchange rate after these new results that I just showed you today for the first time. But I'm happy to talk more about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. So now we'll have Ernesto's presentation.
Okay, so here's me again. Ernesto Pastel, in case you did not record my name and the first time I said it. So I'd like to thank Elias for his comment because it gave me the perfect opportunity to talk about this paper, which is about Chilean data. And as you will see, is mainly about how explore the idea that frequency of price changes changes through time or with shocks and with states. Okay, so the main takeaway is uncertainty affects the effectiveness of monetary policy depending on how it materializes. I'm going to be more precise later, but basically that's the message. Uncertainty is we are not sure what is going to happen. Well, how long it takes for things actually to happen and how much the changes are going to be and exactly in what is going to make a difference in the way that monetary policy is going to affect the economy. So, and this is what we mean. So price setting is a forward-looking variable. As I said in the discussion, we need to think about or decide future prices in order to decide our prices today. Uncertainty, when we think about uncertainty, when we talk about uncertainty, we typically refer as higher variance of future outcomes. Future is the key word. So nothing is going on right now. We're just more uncertain that things may happen in the future. But quite too often, uncertainty is correlated with higher current volatility or with other things that may be happening on the spot. So for instance, if you think about the Ukrainian war, yes, we don't know what is going to happen. But at the same time, a lot of things are happening right now. firms are getting exposed to probably more volatile shocks, or maybe there are some first moment things that are going on too, energy prices, I don't know, some other stuff that may be affecting the price setting. So it's very, very difficult to disentangle between the effect on volatility and the effect of uncertainty in the data. We believe that we have found one case in which we can tell these two things apart, which is using microdata for supermarkets in Chile during the 2019 riots. Then what I'm going to do is first I'm going to show you a bunch of empirical results. Then I'm going to give a model interpretation for those empirical results. And the counterfactual message, which is the one that is on top, basically comes from the model. And then we can discuss whether that message is going to come only from that model or from alternative model, other way to think about the result that we find in the data, and so on and so forth. So let me give you a preview of the empirical analysis, empirical results. So the 2019 riots in Chile is a 1 month of protests, burning and looting, and attacks to public and private property. During that 1 month, we show that supermarkets' frequency of price changes go down, while the average size of price changes conditional on a price change goes up. You may think, okay, maybe this has nothing to do with supermarkets. It's basically something coming from the suppliers. We run the same type of regressions that we do to look at the effect of the riots on the pricing behavior, but this time of the suppliers, and we find no change in behavior whatsoever. Also, you may think, oh, you know, there's many ways in which these riots may affect price setting. Some of those possibilities that you may be thinking of at this time may be correlated with the intensity of the riots. How close are the riots relative to your own store? Well, we find no evidence whatsoever that the varying intensity, the local intensity of the riots affect the pricing behavior of supermarkets. So one possible interpretation is that the riots signal something about the future to price setters. They react to that, but nothing else was happening on the spot. And so we interpret it as a news about future higher idiosyncratic volatility. And there's some other possible interpretations: rationing attention, higher menu cost. I mean, you name it. There are many other possibilities, and we're going to claim that these other interpretations are either ruled out by data, ruled out by the implications of the model, or yield the same policy implications that we're having with our little model. Here we go. So about the data, we have access to business transactions from the universe of VAT invoices between 2014 and 2019. We have the description of the product, buyer, seller, price, and quantity. And we have this data at the transactional level, so we collapse it at the daily level by taking the intraday maximum price, assuming that for a given store, there is no possibility to discriminate across different customers, and any price that is not the largest price charged in the day is because there is some sort of discount, like a coupon or buy three, pay two, stuff like that. And those are going to be like discount prices that are going to be taken out of the analysis. We're going to focus on supermarkets. Why? Because they're going to be well-defined input and output prices. That is going to be important for us to rule out that is nothing going on the supplier side. The unit of observation is going to be the market, location, product, day. So that's going to be one particular, and they're going to get one price. That's going to be one observation. We do a lot of data cleaning, so we have a continuity requirements to make sure that we're not going to use exactly the same sample of goods across the whole sample or most of the sample that we're going to have. We also apply Keyhoe-Midrigan filter, which basically takes out any sort of high-frequency variation on prices, mainly sales, discount prices, things like that. And we're going to explore two data sets. One is what we call the baseline data set, which has about 27,000 products for 67 different supermarkets, and something that we call the match subsample, which are the cases out of these 27,000 products where we can identify the price paid by the supermarket and the local store to the suppliers for exactly the same products on the same week. Therefore, we're going to have the price that the supermarket pays for products and the supermarket at the prices that the supermarket charge to customers on the shelves. And this is about a little bit less than 9,000 products. So let me tell you a little bit about the riots. So a comment that I made to Carlos is that a shock, I mean, if a shock is affecting many things at the same time and it's expected, then it's going to be invalid. So I'm going to try to convince you that the riots were unexpected, violent, and widespread, what the riots were. So basically on October 6, 2019, Santiago subway fare was raised by approximately 3 cents. On October 18th, there was big disruption in Santiago subway that last until about February 15th. And there were, again, a lot of looting, and we used to have pictures. I took out all of the pictures, but this is something that I kept. So this is let me try to convince you that riots were unexpected. So this is the Google Trends for the word protestas, which I bet that in Portuguese is the same word. And basically, the searches in Google were basically nil until the October 18th, when it was an increase 100-fold higher. The gray area is the area that we consider to be the riot, and we see that afterwards quickly come back, not exactly to the same level, but much lower. This is the police reports for the word desórdenes, which you could see that basically remained relatively low until there was this weekly report. So this is less clean than this data, but basically there is a big spike in this type of reports exactly during the riots, and then it come down also relatively quickly. There was widespread across the country, although there was a lot of regional variation. And some question that we typically have is whether during the riots the same type of products were sold. Therefore, maybe there could be some sort of result, maybe driven by selection of the type of product that had been recorded. There is nothing, there is not much of that. So basically every day, each supermarket sold about 3,700 products. During the month of the riot, there is a fall in the number of different products the supermarket was selling, but this was basically about 3,500 products. So there is a fall, but it's not so much. And this fall is going to be taken care by our continuity filter. So let me go quickly to the baseline specification. So basically, we're going to have a regression. We're going to have a variable of interest that we're going to regress it according to some dummy on the period of the riots. The key parameters are going to be beta. We're going to be a number of fixed effects and a number of controls. We're going to run this for each particular product. The variable of interest, we're going to look at 4 variables. One is going to be the break. So it's the occurrence and sign of the price changes happen in a given day. Or what we call is the delta, is that the magnitude of a price change, whether it's going to be positive or negative. Okay, thank you. And the dummy of the riots, we're going to make it, that's going to be last exactly 1 month. This is daily data. And we're going to have a bunch of fixed effects that I don't have to tell you, but this is the bottom line of the story. So for positive price changes, for positive breaks, so occurrence of a positive price change, occurrence of a negative price change, the size of a price change conditional on a positive price change, the size of a price change conditional on a negative price change, we observe that the frequency of price changes go down kind of symmetrically for positive and negative price changes. The average size of price changes go up. In both cases, it's the absolute value. In both cases, for positive and negative price changes. And how big this effect is going to be, remember that this is daily data. So even if the number looks small, it's really like a fall in the frequency of price changes of about 50% and an increase in the size of price changes of about 20%. Again, you may think, maybe this all coming from the suppliers. So let's run exactly the same regressions for the suppliers. Bottom line, there is no stars, except one there are no stars whatsoever. Now, what happened? Maybe, the intensity of the riot had an effect on the change in the pricing behavior of supermarkets regarding their price setting at the time of the riots. If that's true, we should see that the parameters may change when we interact in the time of the riots with a variable constructed to measure the intensity, the local intensity of the riots. And we see no effect whatsoever either. So taking stock, frequency of price changes goes down while the magnitudes of price changes go up for supermarkets during the 2019 riots in Chile. This is kind of symmetrical for positive and negative price changes. We observed nothing going on suppliers, and we believe that some concurrent factors may not be the main drivers, because if they were, then the intensity of the riots should affect the way that the riots are affecting the pricing behavior of the supermarkets. So our hypothesis is that nothing's going on the spot, but still price changing behavior is changing. This must be because of the expectations of something that is going to happen in the future, in particular, higher future uncertainty. Then we come up with a very out-of-the-shelf menu cost model, pretty standard, with a couple of twists. One twist, so it's going to have intermediate producers that are going to pay a fixed cost to change prices. They're going to be a Calvo Plus component to take care of the small price changes. This is a trick that is pretty common in this type of models. We're going to assume left-to-curve idiosyncratic TFP shocks. And departure one is that we're going to assume that they're going to be new shock on the dispersion of idiosyncratic demand. So this is going to be an idiosyncratic demand shock, which is going to be persistent and is going to have some volatility. And that volatility may change over time. In which way? In a way that is going to be persistent and which is going to have two components. One component that's going to be revealed on the spot at the time when the volatility shock hits, and another component that's going to be revealed one period in advance. The model is going to be monthly, and the time of the riot, the length of the riot is supposed to be a month. So one period is supposed to be like at the beginning of the riots. These models are typically, menu cost models are typically so simple that demand shocks are going to have no effect on price setting. So we need to augment the model a little bit. And we have Kimball aggregator in a way that when there is one of these demand, idiosyncratic demand shocks, the desired price that the firm would like to set for that good is going to change. Therefore, there is an incentive for the firm to change prices if it pays the menu cost. Okay, I don't have time to tell you about more details about Kimball aggregator. This is the calibration that, okay. So one thing that I might say is that something that I'm kind of proud is that in this type of models, typically what people do to calibrate the models is that they get the distribution of price setting, of price changes, and then cook up parameters in the model to try to match that distribution. That includes the distribution, that includes the parameters for the idiosyncratic shocks. Since we have prices on the suppliers, we identify the changes in prices of the suppliers as a sort of change in TFP in the model, and we are going to calibrate the idiosyncratic TFP shocks to the processes of the price changes of suppliers of the supermarkets. And we also can compute sort of markups because we have the price of a good that is sold by the supermarket, and we have the price that the supermarket pay for the same good. Okay, thanks a lot. And therefore, we can compute how much the difference is going to be. In case you're curious, it's about 39%. This is ignoring like labor costs and other type of stuff, but it's kind of relatively clean. Well, to calibrate the Kimball aggregator, we need some sort of measure of how much markups are going to be, how much they're going to vary. So we also use that to calibrate for the Kimball. And at the very end, we get calibration that does sort of okay in all of sort of moments that we tend to look at. We need to compare this model with actually the distribution of price changes in the data. And then we generate data out of this model and run the same type of regression that we got, the baseline regression that I showed you at the beginning. To be honest, numbers are not the same. We are working on trying to make the model to match better the numbers, but something that is kind of reassuring is that the signs are all exactly the same, and actually the signs are actually very similar to the ones that, I mean, are the same that we find in the baseline regressions. And again, we're working on the magnitudes right now. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add monetary policy shocks because we want to study counterfactuals out of this model. And we're going to look at four cases that probably I won't have time to tell you in detail, but basically in a case where there are no new shocks, in a case where there are, and in 3 cases when there are new shocks. One, where the new shocks are drawn unconditionally from the distribution of news. The second is when such dispersion is, when the dispersion stays constant for 1 period, and then when the dispersion increases only 1 period after. And this is what we get. So basically, if there is no new shock, then this is an impulse response function of a monetary policy shock in the model. This is the response of output. This is the month. So the blue line is the response of the menu cost model, forgetting about the new stuff. So there is no news. Basically, there's some there's a monetary policy shock, and this is the way that output is going to react. The green line is what happened if, at the time of the monetary policy shock, there is a new shock on uncertainty, so prices become more sticky. Because prices become more sticky, monetary policy has a larger real effect, which is something that you see on impact or with the green line. But then we assume that the monetary policy, that the new shock on uncertainty never materializes in higher volatility. So volatility of idiosyncratic component demand remain exactly the same, just the new shock. Every period, the price setter said, oh, you know, it's coming a higher volatility of your demand, but that higher volatility actually never arrives. Then what we see is that the real effect of the monetary policy shocks become larger relative to the blue line. Now, what happens if 1 period after the new shocks arrive, the higher volatility does materialize with 1 period lag, which is going to be the black line over here. And we see that the real effect of monetary policy fall quite dramatically and stay relatively low. It's long-lasting, but it's relatively low. And the same thing is going to happen if the new shock is going to arrive with, with the probability that the process of news tells us that it should be. So for that, we run a bunch of experiments, like 1,000 experiments. Then we let volatility to materialize according to a stochastic process, and then we compute the average of that, and it's basically the same thing that if the volatility materializes 1 period after. This, now that I show you this, okay, thank you, we can become creative, and we may play, oh, what happened if the volatility shock doesn't impact on the first period, but impact in the second, and in the second, there is also there is the volatility effect going on, but maybe it could happen later. So this is the type of experiment where we play with the timings. And the bottom line answer is that when the volatility hits, basically has a big effect on the impulse responses of output relative to a monetary policy shock. And this is another example that we were playing with the timings. And again, the bottom line is that the black line and the red line look very different from the green line and also from the blue lines. So to conclude, we use microdata in Chile to study the effect of riots on supermarket pricing behavior, and we find 2 things. Frequency of price changes go down, the magnitudes of price changes tend to go up. We have no evidence of supply effect or concurrent factors. We argue that this is a quasi-natural experiment that allows us to separate volatility from uncertainty, which typically is something very difficult to do in the literature of the real effects of the macroeconomic effects of uncertainty. And then we come up with a quantitative menu cost model plus news on the second moment of shocks that rationalize this funding. And the bottom line message for central bankers is that timing is everything. The timing in which the volatility arrives and the uncertainty arrives and the timing in which that uncertainty is going to materialize is going to have paramount effect on the real effect of monetary policy. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Ernesto.
I'm going to be.
No discussion?
No, yes, yes, I have.
Now we have Eurilton's comments. Eurilton is from Banco Central do Brasil. Thank you, Eurilton, for accepting the invitation for making the comments.
Okay, thank you very much. It's like baking a yummy cookie or a yummy cake. So this paper has all the ingredients of a great paper in macroeconomics today. You have a well-defined crisis episode. So your shock is something that you can almost control. It's a quasi-natural experiment. You have also empirical evidence. You have a structural model to support or to interpret the empirical evidence. And finally, policy implications. So I will summarize a little bit the work that Ernesto and co-authors did. So the main contributions for me is, first of all, the data set. It's a very interesting data set. I don't know, I don't know if people at IBRI here in Brazil or any other institutions that have access to this kind of granular data in pricing have such a data set. So it's very, very rich. So you have the data in the supermarkets, in the location by product. So you can exploit all kinds of possibilities to do empirical work, and not necessarily concentrate on the riots episode. So that is another great contribution, that it introduces this sort of volatility news shock in a menu cost model that was published at QJE a couple of years ago. So in this model, people discuss the role of volatility shocks in the idiosyncratic productivity, but there's no mention to news components. And the last contribution is exactly the use of this unfortunate event at Chile. What they did, so Ernesto made a great job in explaining to you the paper. So it's just for me to organize my ideas. So they use this rich data set to document two stylized facts. First, the decrease of the frequency of the price changes during the riots, and then the frequency decreases, but the size of the change increases. And the two facts have to be interpreted by a model or using some sort of structural shocks. There's a lot of empirical work to dismiss the sort of traditional interpretations, mainly supply and demand shocks. And again, they go to the modern part of the paper, and they introduce the idea of the news shocks in the volatility, but now in the idiosyncratic demand, not in the idiosyncratic productivity as in the previous model that they choose to work with. And they show that empirically they show that the model can explain the stylized facts that they supported by the regressions. And they have finally the policy implication part of the paper that deals with the effectiveness or how powerful are the monetary policy shocks in output. And it depends on the timing in which the central bank chooses to act. So he may act when the new shock happens. So it's going to be a sizable effect. But if he acts in a time frame in which that shock materializes, it's not that powerful. I have a couple of few really random comments that I understand nothing about this literature, so it's just a reader. So the first thing is the empirical part of the paper. So they dismiss a lot of shocks empirically. But in my view, they're dismissing just shocks related to first moments, supply and demand shocks. And they may even empirically dismiss the shocks to second moments that may occur at the same time as the new shocks. It's just a way to design new variables to put in their regressions. It's random, so it's just my mind floating away. They can come up with some realized volatility because the controls are prices for the suppliers, and in the demand side they have the purchases in the supermarkets in a week or 2 weeks previous to the riots. They mention in the modeling part, but they may put additional controls to aggregate shocks. They have fixed effects, so probably some effects are being captured by those fixed effects. But there's a lot of things going on, so maybe they should be more explicit about aggregate shocks, aggregate demand, aggregate supply shocks. The new shocks, I understand that the duration is just 1 month. But even though if you are living in Chile, so you are seeing people breaking your business there, you may think that thing can go for a longer period than you don't know when you are making a price decision that the riot is gonna last 1 month. So or even just to see what happens in the model, you should work with longer horizons for the new shock. That's just one suggestion. On the policy implication, the exercise, I know it's a limitation. There's many cost models are very complicated. So they have a nominal expenditure that captures a lot of things, including some sort of monetary policy shock. But in order to solve a very complicated model, they made that variable completely exogenous. So when you think about interventions of central banks, you think about reacting to the shock. So it's not really a reaction. He just put the shocks together. They play with the timing of the shocks, but there are 2 exogenous shocks occurring at the same time, occurring with a delay. That's okay. That's my last comment is just maybe something that may be important or not is in the solution method, the computational method. They use something that is also used in Henke models, or Henke with a C, the classical ones without new Keynesian things. That's the Crusoe-Smith algorithm. Nowadays, we have, I just cited this recent paper from Galo Nuno and Fernandes Villavedo, and they extend that method. What is the idea? The idea is to make the nonlinearities intrinsic in those models to speak louder, and maybe they have some quantitative effect, especially in the impulse response. So it's all that I have to say for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rilton. So now I'll take some questions from the floor. Okay, Carlos, please.
So a couple of things, very nice paper, Ernesto. So just one is just a memory that came back to me in 2013, so 2012 actually. I discussed Joe Vavra's paper at the Bank of Chile conference. And my complaint was exactly that he was confounding uncertainty with large shocks, right? And his implication was that, you know, in recessions, you have this higher volatility, and then prices became more flexible. But it was because more shocks were realizing. And my comment, I sent you the slide, so so you can remember. And your paper answers that precisely, because you have an increasing uncertainty without the realization of the shocks. And then what you see is just the wait and see effect that the inaction region widens. You get more price rigidity. So the policy implication is exactly opposite, in the sense that, you know, of course, this is a 1 month, you cannot extrapolate much, but the insight would be that policy becomes more powerful through this channel of higher price rigidity rather than policy becoming less powerful, which was Joe Vavra's conclusion. So very nice. I just wanted to remember that. The other thing, very quickly, I was curious you guys filter out like the temporary price change, but I think it would be interesting to document empirically whether that margin becomes important. Maybe the firms stop doing promotions or sales during that month. That maybe explains part of the increase in the rigidity, the drop in the frequency. I understand why, you know, these models don't capture these very temporary price changes. You want to relate it to the model, but I think in the empirical part would be nice to show what happens to this margin of the temporary price changes as well.
Thank you, Carlos. Elias, please.
So very brief comment. There's an important difference between uncertainty and fear. I'm wondering if people didn't want to change prices because they feared that their stores were going to be burned if they change prices, as opposed to where the hell is this country going to, kind of uncertainty. To be fair, when Ernesto wrote the paper with Andres and the co-authors, we just started to put together the pricing data. But I'm fairly confident that now, maybe not for this paper, but for a follow-up, you could perhaps merge the information that we have on places that were burned or looted more often with the price changes of firms around those places. And I don't know, my hunch is that, if they're burning places around you, the last thing you want to do is change prices. So that would be perhaps another test that we could do.
Okay, so I have a question from the floor.
Sure. Customer anger. Yeah. So thank you so much for all the comments. Thank you also for the discussion. Yeah, so there are many things that we should take care. So about the aggregate aggregate controls, yeah, we believe that the fixed effects is going to do the deal. Maybe it doesn't do it all the way. You also made a comment about the Gallo Nuno's paper. So I am working with Gallo actually on writing on studying optimal monetary policy out of menu cost models with a bunch of guys from the ECB. And the idea is exactly to explore the nonlinearities coming out of these models and look at the cases in which not when shocks are small, but when shocks are large and when there is uncertainty, stuff that typically log linear models cannot look at. That is exactly the goal of that project. Still long way, hopefully going to present it here some years from now. So about Carlos' first comment, you don't need to send me your slides because this is the one time that I saw Carlos always asking the right questions, but not writing the paper right after. So we wrote the paper, and your motivation, what you said is exactly the motivation that we said out of this model. Now, talking about the customer anger, or first about the intensity of the riot stuff. we did have data on the intensity of the riots. We found that the intensity of the riot had no effect on the way that supermarkets changed their behavior because of the riots. So regardless whether you were close to some areas that were being looted or you were far away, the change in the behavior of oppressed become more sticky was about the same. Now, that said, one may come out with different stories. For instance, a very common comment that we get out of this paper is saying, you know, what happens is that menu costs went up. Why? Because typically you have one guy tagging, you know, the price changes. Now that guy has to take care of the door or whatever, or basically, I don't know, doing whatever and not doing that in particular. Well, comment one is that if that is related to the intensity of the riots, that is ruled out by your results. And if it's not related to the intensity of the riots, and really the guys who were doing the price changes are not doing the price changes anymore during the riots because they were doing something else everywhere, then what is the result we're going to get? Is that when there is the uncertainty, price changes are going to go down, therefore monetary policy is going to become more effective, we're going to have larger real effects. But when the uncertainty is going to get materialized in higher volatility, in larger shocks happening to the stores on the spot, then prices are going to respond more. Therefore, prices are going to become less sticky, and monetary policy is going to lose most of its power, which is exactly the same result that we get. So that's what I said at the beginning. I had a small bullet point at the end saying alternative stories are either ruled out by the data, by the model, or yield the same policy implication that we get. So in some sense, we are not married to the model, to the menu cost model. We can think about some other models that accommodate some facts, but those other models are going to lead the same policy conclusions, and that's what we really care about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ernesto. So now we have Elias' presentation. Elias, the floor is yours.
Thanks, man. Do you have a clicker somewhere? Okay, so I'm not going to stand up. I'm tired. Great. So this is work with Francesco Vigoli, the IMF, and Emiliano Lutini, which unfortunately is not longer with us in the Central Bank of Chile. We had a great placement for him at the World Bank, but such is life. I structured this presentation for a 10-minute talk, so I'll try to stick to 10 minutes. So in the rest of the time, I can tell you more about the effort of putting data together, because I think that could be something valuable for the Central Bank of Brazil as well. I'm not going to spend virtually any time in the motivation, because my colleagues did a great job in motivating why we care about what explains the formation of expectations of firms and why that might matter for pricing decisions. I would like to remark, though, that we know very little about this. And I mean, we know a lot about it from theory, but very little from data, because we don't have great data. And that's basically the contribution of this paper. So in this paper, we're going to study two questions. First, whether informing aggregate inflation expectations, firms put weight on the costs that they observe along their own supply chains to an extent that violates the full information rational expectations hypothesis. That is, they overweight what's going on in their own supply chain when they form aggregate inflation expectations. The answer to that is going to be yes. That's kind of the main result of the paper. Second, we're going to document that this actually matters, because I'm going to show you what we believe to be the first Phillips curve estimation at the firm level, with all the ingredients at the firm level. And we find that inflation expectations, for whatever reason they're formed, pass pretty much one-to-one to pricing decisions. Okay, so that matters. Let me talk a little bit about the data. So we are going to use the sample between 2015 and 2021, which is a good sample. We have a fair amount of variation in aggregate inflation. Now we're working on adding 2022 and 23, which is even better. That's when inflation really started to behave differently. And we match 5 data sources here, okay? The first is, well, the expectation surveys. Actually, we have a monthly expectation surveys that are of, they ask firms about their overall prospects of the economy. So there are many questions about activity, employment, but there is a question about inflation expectations at a 1-year horizon. What do you think overall CPI is going to be at a 1-year horizon? And this is a quantitative question, okay? So it's not higher, lower, it's like a number, okay? The second one, this is for manufacturing and retail firms, the survey. The second data is the VAT registry from the IRS that this Ernesto already described, but basically this is the whole network of transactions of firms. And when I say transactions, I mean that when a firm is buying from another firm, we know who the two firms are, and we know what it is that they're buying, and we know at the price at which they're buying this. This doesn't come up directly in the data. There's not like a drop-down menu that says, I'm selling 2 liters of Coca-Cola at, $2 each. But you can figure that out because people write in the invoice. And using, artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, we've managed to basically transform that into what we call glossas, with basically description of the products that are being transacted with the unit prices associated with it. That was like a 3-year-long effort, but that's in the past, so that's good. Then we have information on customs. This is actually the longest data set that we have in Chile, I think. That it records all the imports and exports. In this case, we're going to use information on imports of all the, the imported prices that firms use as part of their inputs. Then we have, of course, the monthly revenue of firms, and this also describes the purchases of materials. There's some additional information here because it also describes whether you're purchasing capital goods and stuff like that. And we have the Bureau of Unemployment Insurance information about who you're hiring and how much you're paying these people, and so we have all the information on wages at the firm level. This is just motivation graphs. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the evolution of input price inflation and so PPI and the price that firms charge for their products. And basically, the message here is that they move more or less, closely in the same direction. The correlation is shown in the right-hand side. It's positive. It's not great, but it's positive. But in the graph of the left, I want to highlight that there's not an order of magnitude, but 5 times larger variation in PPI than in the prices that actually firms are charging to final consumers. Okay, so that's the level of the difference, the magnitude of the difference. So let me now go to the main regression that we want to estimate. Okay, so we want to estimate whether the expectation, the changes at the firm level of what you expect overall CPI to be for Chile in the next 12 months, how is that affected by the variables which are on the right-hand side, which include, apart from fixed effects, they include basically the overall CPI, lagged CPI, of course. So information about what's going on to the aggregate level of inflation in the economy, And very importantly, and this is the second term I'm going to point here, but that doesn't make any sense because you're not seeing anything. So I'm going to point here, but that doesn't point either. So it does. Here. Ah, good. So this one, that gamma p, that's the crucial one. That's the coefficient associated with the price changes that you observe within your supply chain. So these are the weighted average price that you observe from the stuff that you are buying, okay? How that affects inflation expectations. So basically, after doing some house cleaning and so on, we're going to estimate these effects, and I'm going to show you the results in a second. But let me just say that this strategy, and especially, it's not the strategy really, it's the data, has a couple of advantages. First, we think we are doing a decent job controlling for orthogonality in the sense that we are controlling for aggregate inflation, lag aggregate inflation. So that should immediately make a strong case for the idiosyncratic prices that you are observing in your supply chain. You should not take those into account when forming aggregate inflation expectations, okay? Unless, of course, they have some predictive power for future inflation that we're not capturing in this regression. And I'm going to show you the next slide kind of takes care of this, okay? What are some of the strengths of this approach or the data? Input prices, as I said before, are exogenously determined with respect to firms' inflation expectations. So this is just stuff that they observe in their supply chain. There are direct measures of prices observed by firms, and this is different from the other papers that do sectoral inflation. And we do counterfactuals where we aggregate inflation at the sectoral level, and we try to replicate the results from the other papers. And we show that basically they find qualitatively similar results, but what I'm going to show you basically has less noise, essentially, because it's at the firm level. And also, expectations are elicited at a 1 year horizon. That's what the questionnaire asks, which is good for the central bank because that's, I mean, we have a 2 year horizon, but a 1 year horizon, it's still a it's a relatively medium-term horizon, so that's useful for policy. And also the fact that the survey is high frequency relative to other surveys or other papers that are in the literature. I mean, this happens every month, okay? So that reduces to some extent the possibility that this is driven by other confounding factors. Let me just very quickly show you the results of the main regression. So in the left-hand side of this graph, I'm showing you the effect of increasing in one standard deviation the cost that you observe in your supply chain, how that affects your inflation expectations. And it affects roughly in 6 basis points, okay? On the right-hand side, you see the effect, the comparatively larger effect that we, of course, should expect of observing a higher aggregate CPI in the country. Okay, so when the inflation number, or the aggregate inflation number comes up larger, then firms also increase their expectations, and that's around 0.4 percentage points for each standard deviation. So this is to be expected. The thing is that the figure in the left-hand side basically should be 0, right? Now, if I haven't been very convincing about the orthogonality, we do a further exercise when we select a subset of the firms for which we run the following regression for all the firms, okay? We see whether the prices that they're observing along the supply chain has any predictive power for future aggregate inflation in the economy. Because that might happen. I mean, maybe there's a valuable information, say in the supply chain of large firms that has not shown up yet in CPI, but might show up later. So we run this regression, and we're only going to keep the firms for which we can demonstrate that there is absolutely no predictive power. And this is the case for most of the firms. It's like 90% of the firms or 85% of the firms. We run the regression for those 85% of the firms. We essentially get the exact same results. Now, there are better ways of doing this, of controlling for orthogonality. We've received some comments already, and we are doing so, but let me not bother you with that. And let me get to the last part because I want to save some minutes to talk about the data. This is the Phillips curve at the firm level. Okay, so we take the Rothenberg model, we do some adjustments, some assumptions, and in the end what we run is a regression in which on the left-hand side you have the prices that firms are charging on average for their products, okay? And on the right-hand side you have the expectations of aggregate inflation of those same firms and the marginal costs of those firms. And let me just finish with this table. I don't know if the numbers are large enough that you can see, but let me just highlight here that on the very, I want to highlight this one, this first row here. Basically, the coefficient of the Phillips curve at the firm level of inflation expectations to prices is not significantly different from 1. So there's full pass-through of what you expect inflation to be and what you're going to charge for your prices. So that's basically our paper. We show that there is some evidence of a lack of rationality or at least complete rationality in the sense that firms tend to put relatively more, no, I should not say relatively more, they tend to put weight in the formation of their inflation expectations to changes that in the supply chain that are rather idiosyncratic to them, that are not related to aggregate inflation, but they still weight those when they make aggregate inflation projections. And we find that this matters because those expectations pass one-to-one to aggregate prices. Now, do I have 5 minutes? Or how much?
6 minutes. And
Great, that's much better than I thought. So let me just make some quick comments on the value of information. Okay, so we've been working on putting together data for the last 8 years. Okay, and this is it's hard work, and the hard work is not on the servers or hiring the right people or merging the data. The hard work is institutional part, as many of you are aware. Okay. But I wanted to say this, Andre, in this conference in particular, because in many countries, the data does not exist. So there's nothing to discuss. But in Brazil, the data exists. It's just that the data is lonely. Some data is here, the other data is there, and it doesn't come together. And the value of data increases exponentially when it is brought together, okay? There are many benefits. Let me just mention a few. You increase your speed of making analysis because administrative data is typically available much faster than the statistics. But that's not the most important part. Disaggregated data allows deeper analysis, and especially it allows to evaluate policies because you can use usually you evaluate policies at the firm level. But you guys already know this, so let me emphasize some other things that we've learned in the process. When you have good data, 2 very positive things happens within central banks. First, you are able to attract and retain very good researchers because they want to work with the data. So we suspected that, but now we've experienced that in the last 5 years in the bank. And the second, and this was a novelty, I didn't expect this to happen, there is this typical trade-off of having good economists. You want to have good economists in your bank for advising policy, but the problem of advising policy is that that's considered a tax for many researchers. Typically in the banks, you have the guys who do research and other people who do policy, and sometimes you ask the researchers to do policy, but that's considered a tax. But when you have good data, this starts blurring and the separation essentially disappears because there are a lot of very important policy questions that if you had good data to answer them, they are top 5 material. And I think, I don't know, Ernesto, if you agree with me on that, but this has aligned the incentives of our research team in the sense that most of the papers that are coming out of the bank that have a pretty good chance, and some already have been published in very good journals, are actually motivated by questions from the board. So that's a benefit that I did not expect, and it's a big win. Now, I talked to some of the people in the Central Bank of Brazil, and they tell me, Elias, we know all that, but this is impossible because it's data from the IRS. We can look in Chile. We had the same situation. Okay, the first time we started analyzing this, we didn't have any of this data. So let me suggest a couple of strategies. Okay, and the first point I want to mention is the following: the value for the public administration of merging data is an order of magnitude larger than the value for the central bank. And you guys should be able to convince them of that. Because what we do is monetary policy. The rest of the government does all the other policies. And when you don't have good data, what happens is that when, something bad happens, you need to give out a lot of money in a non-targeted way, which is what happened to most countries in the COVID crisis. But if you have good data, you start giving money in a targeted way. You start evaluating policies in a much better way with analysis of much higher quality. You could do optimal policy. You could do better timing of policies. So I think this is a very, very strong case to convince the government, the IRS, whoever is your counterparty that doesn't want to share the data, that it's in their best interest to share the data. It's actually not for the benefit of the central bank, it's for the benefit of them. So my final comment, Andre, would be, don't give up. There are very few countries in the world that have the data that you guys have. And when there's a will, there's a way. And you should keep trying. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elias, for this suggestion. We've been trying very hard to get those data. At least you got some data from the Minister of Labor, but from the IRS, these guys are more difficult. But we should keep the effort. So thank you. Carlos, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the opportunity of reading and discussing this great paper by Elias and co-authors. There was a bit of back and forth whether there would be a discussion or not. So I don't have a lot of slides, but I have a few comments, hopefully trying to contribute to improvement in the paper. So what the authors do, right? So Elias presented, but I'll give a brief summary and then go to my comments. So they study how firms form inflation expectations and how these affect their price setting decisions. So in a sense, like a holy grail of this literature to have price data and inflation expectation data for the same firms. To that end, they leverage a unique data set on Chilean firms, merging various data sets that Elias mentioned here. So expectation survey records from VAT that allows them to get price data and to figure out the supply chains of firms, custom registries to look at import prices, and they have also some labor market data to, they have the wage bill and so forth. So what they show is that firms rely on price changes observed along their supply chain to form expectations about inflation. So basically they look at, the prices that they are paying for their inputs, how those prices are changing, and that affects their inflation expectations. And then they estimate Phillips curves at the firm level and find full pass-through of changes in inflation expectations to sales prices. So this, finding rejects full information rational expectation hypothesis and are consistent with firms' disagreement about future inflation and inattention to macroeconomic news. I think it's a great paper. The data set is fantastic, as Elias showed to us. So I have a few comments, and are in the spirit of raising the bar for you guys to even improve the paper even more. So one is about identification, which, as Ernesto pointed out, applies to my paper. I think applies to Elias' paper as well, even though I think they have hope of making more progress, right? Relative, for example, to what we can do with the Brazilian data. So we don't have truly exogenous variation in expectations, right? This is likely unsurmountable. Again, as I argued, the exclusion restriction, I think, is going to be violated by any instrument that you think about that will meaningfully shift inflation expectations. But they have this evidence that firms form expectations based on input prices. So I think this gives some hope that maybe you can exploit this granular instruments, stuff that I'm not really familiar with, so I'm kind of brainstorming here a little bit. But maybe there's a way to find, maybe you can find good instruments for these input prices, and because these input prices affect inflation expectations, this is kind of serves as an instrument for their own inflation expectations. So maybe you can try to establish causality here or exogenous variation more forcefully, okay? Now, I think there's a second identification issue, which is the following. We were talking a little bit about this in years before. So you showed that expectations at the firm level depend on their input prices, which basically are their costs. So it's not clear to me how you can tell apart the role of the marginal costs versus the firm's expectations, which are affected by those costs in the Phillips curves. I'm not saying that you cannot estimate those equations, that they are not valid, but just because of collinearity, maybe like all the weight will go to one coefficient. It's hard to separate the role of the two when they are kind of related, right? So that's something maybe you guys could also do something about, again, trying to think of maybe instruments for the costs. It's related to the first point, but it's slightly different. The other comment I have pertains to magnitudes, okay? So let's grant causality, and now let me think if the effects are big or small, okay? As you showed, and I have the graphs here, so the coefficient on CPI is an order of magnitude larger than the coefficient on input price inflation, right? You mentioned kind of 6 basis points for one standard deviation in the case of input price inflation versus 0.4 for CPI inflation. So I think what I'm missing here is kind of a variance decomposition in a sense. If you look at that equation that explains the individual firm expectations, and you put on the right-hand side, you have both sort of components. You have CPI inflation, and you have the input price inflation. Which one is more important? So the coefficient is an order of magnitude different, but I'm guessing the input price inflation is way more volatile. You give some information about that in the paper, but I'm missing kind of a punchline. Look, here's the variance decomposition, and these are the relative contributions, right? So again, this is the chart that Elias mentioned. Like the left-hand side coefficient is small, the right-hand side is one order of magnitude bigger, but maybe the variances will change meaningfully, and that would be my prior the variance contributions here. From this picture, which is what you guys emphasize, so you guys emphasize a lot the cross-sectional dispersion in these input price inflation and sales price inflation measures. But those are different things, right? So what will really matter here is time variation. So it's variance along the time dimension for the variance contribution of these individual expectations. So we can see there are different scales. The left-hand side is the firm level thing. It's much bigger. The range is big, but I think if you just go for a variance decomposition of the reduced form regression, I think that will be very clear what are the relative importance. And finally is like maybe it's a personal preference thing, but I wouldn't emphasize as much like the failure of full information rational expectations as much as you guys do. For the following reason, I think there are many papers showing that full information rational expectations fail, the assumption fails, okay? So of course, you have one more piece of evidence that full information rational expectations fails, but I wouldn't hammer as many times as you guys do along the paper that, because I think the much more interesting part is, okay, we know it's not full information rational expectation, but you guys have a say on how firms are forming expectations, which is this supply chain channel. So I would hammer much more kind of the mechanism that you guys find rather than just violating full information rational expectation, because there are many violations, and I think that doesn't, it underestimates the value of the contribution if you just put it as, okay, here's yet one more violation of FIRE. Okay, the last but one bullet is a typo from the previous slide, I guess, that I didn't, the virus decomposition thing. And then the last one is maybe just a quibble that when you derive the individual Phillips curves, you are assuming some rationality, right? So you have violation of fire, but it's not incompatible. There's not a problem there, but you are assuming some rationality, even though you're saying that you violate fire. Maybe you could be a bit more specific about the assumptions that you impose for the Phillips curve, which still are consistent with fire violations. So yeah, these are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. So now we can have questions from the floor. Please, Felipe.
Yeah, the data you guys have is really amazing. So this was kind of very nice to see. One quick question. So do you have much information about how the input prices are set? So one thing that worried me a little bit when you talked about orthogonality is that if those prices are negotiated with the customer, right, then it's going to incorporate whatever expectations the customer has about inflation coming from other sources. You might be able in your sample to kind of pick suppliers that have many customers and have the same price for all of them and, you know, exploit that somehow. I mean, I'm sure given the richness of your data, there's a lot you can do, but it's just something that crossed my mind that worried me a bit.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. So, and the last ones. Coffee break is waiting for us.
It's just a quick question related to market share of the company. Are you able to control for that? Because if a firm has lots of market share for a specific product and the input costs go up, as Carlos said, maybe this is a cost that they are kind of passing through customers. If they have market power, they know that inflation is going to go up because they are the ones that are going to do that. So.
Now I have over there the last question.
So I'm kind of a bit worried with the inclusion of the COVID-19 period. So in a sense, I mean, if you look, inflation was pretty low for a long time, and then it accelerates a lot by the end of the sample. And especially their input costs were very important for price setting, right? Because you had all the supply chain shocks and all that. So I would try to stop before that and see if the results change or not.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. So first of all, Carlos, thanks. That was a great discussion. I should also say that this paper is kind of in motion. we submitted it already. We got a couple of comments. Some of them actually overlap quite a bit with what you said. So I mean, we are thinking about how to deal with some of the identification issues. One way of dealing with identification issues is that we at the central bank also make surveys. And we can make the survey that we want. We make a survey every 3 months, and it has what we call a fixed module and then a variable module. And then variable module, we can ask whatever we want. And the surveys, as all these other data, have the firm identifiers. So we can get the survey into the data set, and then we can control for maybe, you know, randomized control trials or exogeneity of, and this is sort of actually we've already done some of this, but we haven't yet done the analysis. But one of the recent surveys we did tried to control for, made specific questions to try to control for identification. So that's probably coming in the next version of the paper. Let me address some. I really agree with your broader point that you did, and this is a conversation that we're having with the co-authors on how much to emphasize that there's a violation of fully rational expectations, which is, you know, that's we kind of already know that from other papers. So still, we're showing it here, but maybe we would, it would have a higher value added, the paper, if we try to give more details on how expectations are formed in general. And actually, to be very candid in my response, we are really thinking about splitting the paper into one part that takes, a very detailed look into what explains the formation of expectations, right? Including the violation of rationality, but going broader than that. And then another part that just, focuses on the Phillips curve side. So that's, so the comments very well taken. The questions that I got from the floor, let me see. Yes. So yeah, indeed, I think you asked me this, right? The first one. Right, prices are negotiated. So we've done some controls. I can't recall right now, but we've done some controls on firms that are smaller, don't have market power, or we could. The thing is, when we start restricting the sample, I mean, we have a lot of information, but remember that our bottleneck is that we only have inflation expectations for a subset of the firms. So all the rest of the information is for the universe of Chilean firms. But the inflation expectations information is the one that we cannot, we don't have the luxury of dropping too many of those. But we could maybe do a richer analysis in terms of considering, say, the prices that you get from suppliers, which charge the same prices to everybody, or we could control, for example, instead of inputting the price that the supplier charges to you, we could put the price that the supplier charges on average to the other customer it has. So it's some sort of a control. So that's something like that we can do, and I don't think we've done that. So that would be thank you for that suggestion. Market share, I think Carlos asked me that, right? Yes, I mean, there is definitely an issue of market share in Chile. I think we partially take care of this in the sense that, remember, we did that regression in the middle that I maybe didn't explain very much, but we indeed find that for some firms, what they observe along the supply chain has some predictive power for aggregate inflation. So maybe those are the large firms. And we are excluding them from the sample in the robustness section. So I think that partly takes care of it, but I like your suggestion, and we could consider something a bit broader and document whether, overall impulse response of either expectations or actual price changes differ in markets where, market power is different. So that, I think that's a broader way of taking your comment. COVID, yes, that's true. The COVID kind of, I don't know if it messes up things or it makes it more interesting, because that's when inflation goes up. What we are definitely doing in this second revision of the paper is that we want to separate into high and low inflation periods, which basically is going to be the pre-COVID and the post-COVID sample, and see how things change in that regard. So thank you very much. Those were great comments.